for those of you who are slightly older listening to this, as you listen to Cameron and I, who were in high school at the time, just recognize that there is nobody in college right now who was alive when this happened.
Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Ringhouse.
Well, as of this recording that you're listening to, tomorrow will be September 11th. And so we wanted to take the occasion to reflect a bit on that very sad and momentous day. I think one way to start would just be in, I think, the typical way these days to talk about a little bit where we were first. I was in, well, actually, it unfolded throughout two classes for me. So I was in high school. So it started when I was in my drama class, Shakespeare in particular, sitting next to my friend Hallie. We sometimes will talk about this still to this day. And then it really unfolded. Both the towers came down live on, we watched the live footage unfolding when I was in my history class in a trailer, because our school was one of the overflow trailers. I don't know if you had those, Nathan,
but
at my school,
you're out in the parking. You crossed the parking lot to get to class.
That's right. I mean, at the time, they've had to since build another school to accommodate the increasing numbers, but we were close to 4,000 kids at the time. So there just simply wasn't room in the school anymore. So we were in a trailer, and that's when the rest of it, we basically sat there and watched it. But what about you? Where were you?
Man, I did not realize we had this in common. I was in a theater class as well.
That's
but not
wild.
by choice. I was the last group to get to choose classes my freshman year of high school, and had to take this class because there was no room for me anywhere else in the schedule. But we were, this is a terrible story. We were doing improv emotional speeches, and our teacher went out of the room, came back in and told this story, and she was crying and everything. And we thought that had to be the best. Oh no, we thought she was totally making it up. And we clapped at the end.
Oh no.
So, and then it very, very quickly, I mean, just because it was so outlandishly out of the realm of possibility of like something that, none of us had any concept of what that, I don't even think I knew there was a World Trade Center at this point in my life. So anyway, and then that, it kind of rapidly unfolded from there. And then we went home earlier that afternoon and so forth. But
I do. So
I couldn't contextualize it really because I didn't have enough of an understanding of the world in order to make sense of it. So let me say that. Let me also say that for those of you who are slightly older listening to this, as you listen to Cameron and I, who were in high school at the time, just recognize that there is nobody in college right now who was alive when this happened. So if you just want a little reminder of how fast time moves, that none of none of the college students right now were even born. And so this isn't what's weird about our perspective here, Cameron, is we kind of lived in the middle of knowing a world before and after, but we're quickly moving into a young adult sphere who had no before experience. And so I think that's part of the interesting thing here, that you I think you had a more global perspective than I did, but it's a different world, and that's what we want to look at.
It's true. Yeah. So we live in a post 9/11 world now. But there are, as you pointed out, many for whom that's the only world they've ever known. And that is an amazing thought. Yeah. Well, so I'm not sure I had that much. I don't think I had a particularly cosmopolitan perspective at the time. I did have an international background. So I had that going for me because I'm a third culture kid. So I had grown up in Western Europe and then moved to the United States not too long early. I mean, only in 1998. This happened in 2001. So, and I had a dad with a very rich historical perspective for whom this was a horrifying day, but it did not arrive as a complete shock to the system for my dad. I will say that. And it wasn't utterly foreign because Dad had spoken a lot about some of the global aspirations of radical Islam, for instance, and theocracy. I mean, these are the kinds of, my dad was an apologist, but working with a lot of people who did outreach to Muslims as well. So these conversations were unfolding in my house. But I do remember walking around the high school sensing in my bones that something monumental had happened and changed, but not quite knowing how to articulate it. I remember the spectrum of responses. Lots of people were passing me were crying. Others just looked a little bit confused and perplexed. I remember one guy in particular making eye contact with me and going, "This is awesome." Now, I don't think he had any idea what he was really saying. He's just one of this would have been the typical mall goth kind of kid with an anarchy sign, on his shirt. But there was a lot of confusion. But so let me start us off in this way as we reflect on it. I think one major outworking that we ended up having to deal with for a long time when our own ministries began was before 9/11, we were kind of in this space. Well, we Americans and people in the West were kind of in this space where the thought was secularism has kind of won the day. Yeah, but also, the liberal order is really here to stay. And it wasn't so much, the Francis Fukuyama end of history, but it was kind of that sort of ethos of, well, here we are, the free market. This is what everybody wants. Clearly, if you're an enlightened society, this is the kind of life that you want, and everybody's happy here. And religion is kind of past its sell-by date. It's certainly not an important. Maybe it's an interesting conversation. Maybe it's an interesting academic subject, but it doesn't really carry any political force or anything like that. And then this happens, and it was just brain-breaking for many people who, frankly, a lot of people still have a hard time. They'll use different language to try to explain this away. Oh, well, this is a radical faction of an inherently peaceful religion, for instance. You'll hear that said. Now, it is true. This is complex. There are millions of. I like Andy Bannister, our friend Dr. Andy Bannister, who did his PhD on Islam. I like his line about this. There are millions of, I think, moderate and peaceful Muslims. There is no such thing as a moderate Islam. And that's just simply true. That if you pay any attention to the actual teachings of the Quran or you look at the hadiths, that's just true. But suddenly you saw this unfolding in very practical and horrifying terms at great cost. And you saw these aspirations, these theocratic aspirations writ large. And so one thing that happened was, I think this was a big catalyst for the new atheist movement, which again is part of sort of recent ancient history right now, isn't it, Nathan? You certainly don't hear a lot about the new atheists these days, but there was this, I think the first one that really kicked this off was Sam Harris's Letters to a Christian Nation. Wasn't that? That kind of was lighting the blue torch paper for the new atheist movement. But really, I think that was more fueled by people who saw religion as something inherently violent and poisonous. And they thought, hey, aren't we past the days of inquisitions and, religious wars? And now this is rearing its ugly head again in the 21st century. What the heck is going on? Kind of deal. I've said a lot, but seems to be another sort of, yeah.
Well, there's another element here is that America hasn't really ever been attacked in a significant way. So you look at the world wars, European history, or all of Asia. So obviously Revolutionary War kind of thing, but as far as a large scale bombing or destruction, you could see how America kind of developed this sense of impenetrability, so to speak, and so this was just kind of a glaring popping the bubble of our own confidence in our own safety. So I think there's a way in which maybe Americans, this was even harder for America, who doesn't have a deep history of planes causing destruction over our country, for example. It pops a lot of bubbles. I do remember, though, you jumped right to the new atheism, but there was a pretty big surge in, you could see "God Bless America" on a McDonald's sign at this time. So, do you remember that, Cameron, too? There was
yes.
The American flag was back out. There was really a deep sense there for a little while, anyhow, of I think of national unity.
Well,
you had something to be against, even if you didn't understand it, that flourished for a moment there.
Yeah, well, that's something that James Davison Hunter talks about. He calls that negative solidarity, and you did have that moment. You're right, and we shouldn't skip over that. So there was, and I don't know precisely, everybody, when we talk about that, the brief unity, whenever I read about it, Nathan, the only, nobody, I don't know, has anybody ever actually measured how long this was? Everybody always just says it was really brief. It was really quick. The nation came together for just a tiny moment. There were, sort of bipartisan efforts but yeah, so it was
I don't know. It lasted long enough to justify a war on terror being kicked off with, I guess, majority public support.
Another massive subject right there.
Right.
Which I always thought Stanley Hauerwas's line on that was very helpful, and he's not the only one to make this observation, that a phrase like war on terror is so open-ended, and there's no end to a war on terror.
Well, war on drugs, war on poverty, pick your other,
right. Correct. Yeah, exactly. So it becomes this, it justifies a kind of, it's a one-way street, and a lot of, so you had the brief moment of unity, you had the war, and then you had this very strong reaction as well against religion.
Well, but can we separate that out a little bit? Because you have the new atheism who starts writing books against religion, but you also had a whole lot of dudes who are like, that's it, I'm enlisting right now, let's go. And so there was an already underlying cultural split in people's concept of what a country was, what their religious duty was, how they thought about God and country, nation, state, what their response was to. So there's a sense in which, momentary unity, but then probably a deepening highlighting of the differences, not only of, actually probably for a lot of Americans, it was kind of like a first reminder of the globalization of the world, or thinking about America in terms of the world, not just, so if you're listening to this from a different country, this sounds weird, but if you think about how big America is, like, most Americans don't leave America. And if you live in a different part of the world, like, it's like traveling to a different state to go to a different country. Just to put this in context, take like England. The size of England, the United States grows 3 times more acres of corn than England is as a country. Like, their whole nation is a third of the size of our corn patch. So it's very easy as an American to kind of think of America as the world, especially at that time. Because again, the internet was not really, did you have internet in your house in 2001, Cameron?
We did, but it hadn't. Yeah, but it wasn't the full.
But what was on there? But what was on the internet?
Phenomenon. Oh, it was very crude.
Email?
By today's standards, absolutely, and it was. Yeah, and it was probably still making those, I think, the cartoon sounds to connect. The Looney Tunes kind of was still happening, and I was So it wasn't the connecting phenomenon that it is today. Obviously, no.
So no social media, no YouTube.
No.
Actually, was there really any? There wasn't a lot of video associated with the internet, even at that point, was there?
Mm-mm.
Surely there had to be, but
not that
we didn't have
the
camera technology.
Hardly the person to ask.
Yeah, but cell phones weren't mainstream at this point. So as far as like our perspective of what the world was and how we were getting information, man, this is sounding wild the more I think about it. It was a very different time technologically, which gave us a very different sense of how the world worked and functioned. And that had to play into this significantly as well, I would think.
It does, but even to this day, one of the things that hasn't changed too much, and maybe it will with rising generations who are more international and cosmopolitan and do have a necessarily, I don't even want to call it a global perspective. I think I'd rather just call it a globalized perspective, because people nowadays haven't necessarily traveled very far, but you don't have to travel very far to have a kind of a more international perspective these days. But but still, Nathan, when you hear political analysis of, say, what's tensions in the Middle East, or actually our real entry point nowadays to some of these issues is the immigration crisis that's happening pretty much all over the West. It's happening in the United States. It's definitely happening in Europe. Think about, so if we look at England right now, you have whole sections of London that are effectively, you go into those areas and it's basically like entering into a different country, an Arab nation, right?
Yeah, I've been there.
And the language,
Arabic street signs.
So it's Arabic street signs. I mean, so there's a raging debate about this. There are people who basically say, in very simple terms, hey, look, I'm not xenophobic. I don't hate anybody, but that's not good. This is England. And this represents a real threat to our way of life. Multiculturalism as a movement can be declared a failure. It has failed. You have to have some kind of integration that has to happen. But if people are unwilling to do that, that causes serious problems in a country. But when these conversations happen, they still are very politically, or I don't know, religiously naive in a way that you would think September 11th and events like that would have opened eyes. People still, well, no, it's just, we need to welcome people in. And these are, yes, there's some differences in their ethnic ways of life, but these are, there's no radical, the radicals are separate, in a separate category from, for instance, Muslims. So we don't need to worry about religious convictions clashing with our culture. Now, not everybody says that, but a lot. I mean, I've watched so many of these conversations lately, Nathan. I know you have too.
Yeah, but
people essentially do say that. I'm like, how can you believe that?
The way that you believe that is you can't fathom that somebody doesn't want what you want.
So that's it. That's the myopic spot that hasn't changed from what I can see so far.
Yeah.
Everybody would want this. So how could everybody
wants
this?
Everybody wants a highly
Starbucks
high
on every
economy
corner.
Starbucks, commercialized, globalized democracy is what the world craves. And then you run into something like 9/11 where people attack the thing that you think they want, and then you're left reeling because you can't understand that the world doesn't want what you want. Ta-da!
Now, can we interject a piece of irony in here? Which
sure.
Nathan, I think you've brought this up in past episodes, but our way of life in America, part of what causes such seething anger and hatred in, say, people who are some devout Muslims in Arabic nations, is that they can see very clearly how unbelievably seductive life is in America. And all you need to do to see that borne out is to look at the porn trends that happen in Arabic nations and all that. I mean, a lot of this stuff is being consumed over there. And
sure,
they don't see this as a good thing. This is a horrible thing. And it leads to self-loathing and all of that.
Yeah, but you also have like porn in Bin Laden's cave. But there's also a lot of porn found in Bin Laden's cave.
That was such an eye-opening moment.
Right.
Yeah,
so
sure.
that's a... So Western culture does meddle, for sure.
Yes.
Against theocratic beliefs of other nations.
It does. But we're also, another aspect here that's really tough to deal with, but we've talked about this before too, is when some of these groups like Al-Qaeda, when they prove to be successful in their recruiting efforts, it's often with upper middle class, Caucasian,
educated
young people.
Mm-hmm.
Educated. Yeah. And people would say, how could this be? Well, not everybody wants that radical vision of freedom and autonomy that you were mentioning, Nathan, because we are in the midst of a massive meaning crisis and have been for a long time in the United States.
So this parallels what you're saying. But so this morning I was looking in the Wall Street Journal that last year was the first year in South Korea that strollers for dogs outsold strollers for babies. And so I could see, and you're looking at the collapse of the demographic of having kids and having sex. And I can't imagine anybody listening to this podcast that lived through the 60s being able to conceptualize a culture where nobody wants to have sex.
Right.
So,
I mean, yeah.
I'm just using that as an example of our inability to think about or lament, like, what are the patterns or structures that what motivates you is not uniform across the planet. And that can be good or
the
bad.
Levels of loneliness and isolation that we have reached are truly they are unfathomable to many people. Yeah, when you think of the 60s, right, the sexual revolution, where sex basically became a substitute religion in its own right. It was the last sort of expression of total transcendence and freedom.
Yeah, but we don't have to go to a cave in the Middle East or South Korea. I mean, we the same thing crosses our minds of like, okay, just up the road from you last week, Cameron, a 14-year-old shot a bunch of people in a school. Most people are going to say, I can't imagine what was going through somebody's mind that would make them want to do that. So that doesn't mean that the way of life that you are living is wrong. It just means that you're not communicating in the same categories that a lot of people are, or you have a sense of meaning in your life that makes you not want to do you're taking for granted a whole series of foundational elements that stabilize your life that make some of these things unthinkable that actually do make sense if you took away all those foundations from your own life.
Well, let's say some hard things about that incident real quickly, because this is 30 minutes away from me. Certainly everybody in my neck of the woods right now is shaken up, and the very next day I got emails from my children's school saying, we want, a lot of you are writing into us, and basically parents wanted reassurances. What's tragic about that, of course, is there is no special magic for precluding this as a possibility. I mean, yes, we could write into our children's schools. It's understandable that parents do that, but what are they going to do beyond? I mean, they can go through measures and protocols, but we don't have that kind of total control there. So there's that. But also hearing the sheriff who's put it in, you're put in a virtually impossible situation when you have to address a press conference after something like that has happened, right? And he has children in that school system there as well. And so it's hard to come up with words. There are no adequate words. But, he said things like this kid is pure evil. Well, that's a very understandable statement to make. I want to try to speak in compassionate terms, but that's not accurate. This kid, and he's not pure evil. What he did was wicked and is an atrocity, and it's irreversible. Nothing can ever bring those people back. Those 4 people,
and a lot of his home life beforehand was full of lot of brokenness and chaos.
So we have to look at So if you look at his home life, now again, that's not to explain it. Nobody here is explaining away anybody's actions, but it's not a justification. But what we are saying is this a 14-year-old child in an absolutely chaotic environment with 2 people who are supposed to be pouring love and affection and showing him a good example, are doing the very opposite, giving to him a very nihilistic and chaotic vision of life and reality. And I believe his father is being charged. He was charged with involuntary manslaughter, by the way. Yep. But it's just to point out that this kid, I mean, we're all raised by villages still, so to speak, and there are very diseased elements of our communities here, and a crisis of meaning can lead in some extremely dark places. It might lead somebody into,
okay, so hang on a second, because we're blurring. Let me try to pull all these threads together. So we're looking at a sickness within a culture, and a manifestation of brokenness into wicked acts that lead to the destruction, and that's based out of a lack of meaning. That's different than 9/11, which was done out of a certainty about meaning. So you don't hijack a plane.
What I'm trying
fly. So I'm saying, like, there's a sense of like micro scale being attacked, national scale being attacked, darkness and evil and brokenness within them, and meaning is at play in both of those. But it's not just that a lack of meaning leads to an expression of evil. It can be certainty about the wrong things that also are evil. And you weren't saying that. I just wanted to point out that these are different as we go forward here.
Well, part of what I'm trying to clarify is why somebody would be attracted to a theocratic vision in the first place, and why they would not want our way of life as it is here on the ground. So somebody randomly, it's hard to imagine a more naked and vile expression of meaninglessness and emptiness in one's life than getting a weapon and randomly just shedding as much blood as you can, and then maybe, usually as is often the case, turning the gun on yourself in the end. I mean, it's a kind of shriek into the abyss. 9/11, horrendous, massive scale of bloodshed and carnage, obviously, but this was perpetrated by people with a high level of, yes, we would say lethal certainty, but also with real fervor and real conviction, held together by a very serious moral vision. Deeply, deeply misguided, we would say, but a very serious moral vision. And so what I think people are often, what anthropologists and people studying this phenomenon have actually said is that young people are deeply attracted to that moral vision, that sense of cohesion, and that firm sense of right and wrong. So in times of great turmoil and uncertainty, and we're in one of those times right now, they pop up from time to time in history. That's life on earth. But in those times, one of the great temptations is you're drawn to stuff that's crystal clear, absolutely clear. You know exactly what you need to do. You have very clear protocol. You have very clear rules. But there's also, Islam gives you a vision of very thick, I would call it thick meaning, thick religion. And that is deeply attractive to a lot of people, I think, in a culture where everything feels so thin, and there are commitments are just so weak, and strollers for dogs outnumber strollers for children. I mean, Islam has a very rich view of a family, for instance, by the way. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I mean, these are hard truths to talk about, and I'm very aware of that. And we're just
one of the ways that this shows up, Cameron, is that I found, so I went off to college. You come home and you clean out your bedroom, right? And I found a letter that I had written to my classmates about 9/11 in response to the question, why would God allow this to happen? And I was in a hurry cleaning out the desk and a bunch of stuff, and I threw it away. I wish I'd kept it. It'd be interesting to go back and read what 15-year-old Nathan, how I addressed that question. But herein lies the difference, is that we ask the question, why would God allow something like that to happen? Islam doesn't ask that question. There's a certainty that God does what is right, and he owes us no answer. Allah can do what he does. So you don't have to. And so that's, even in there, you see a difference in the way in which we process the events of the world, and we think about humanity in relation to the divine and brokenness and evil. It's a totally different way. So what are we trying to say here? Is that don't fall. A couple things. One is that the stories of how we picture the world to be matters so deeply. We're aware of that.
Yep.
But also, secondly, that not everybody in the world, you cannot assume that everybody in the world sees the world in the same way. And you're naive if you do. And that's just a simple reality that we have to live with in order to live well. There's no two ways about it. And the tendency of our tendency to focus on ourselves gives us this naive sense that everybody wants the world to be like we want it to be, that everybody wants the same thing, that our vision of the good is innate to us and is shared. And I think Christians are particularly susceptible to this, especially if you've grown up within the church, that some things are so familiar to you that you think they're normal to everyone else in the world, and they aren't. But it's actually only when you can separate that out that actually mission and evangelism even becomes a possibility, when you start recognizing that maybe there are people who don't see the world the way that you do merely because they've never thought of it that way. And then that's an exciting feature. So it's not like all hope is lost. We all see the world differently. No, conversion and persuasion and change are all, and education is all part of this project that we're on together. So help me, Cameron. I'm simultaneously saying, yeah, there's darkness and brokenness and bitterness, and there's room for real growth and maturity and hope in this.
Well, I mean, I think this is life. If we pay attention to the Christian vision of reality, we always have to bear in mind that the basic feeling of being a Christian is tension of being in the world, the created order, which is God's good created order, right? God's good creation, but also in a world that needs to be renewed, and then world in the sense of the world, the flesh, and the devil, or fallen human order. So we're in God's good creation, but also in a fallen human order. And the world is deeply damaged and broken because it's been infiltrated by sin and death. So it's filled with beautiful, wonderful expressions of light and rejoicing and self-sacrifice and gorgeous natural scenes. It's also filled with darkness and depravity. Both are true. We struggle if we forget or overlook either one of those aspects of our life as it is. So if we know that, if we're paying attention to reality and we're in touch with reality, we can recognize that. And we have to walk by faith, not by sight, trusting in our Lord that all things are in his hands, and that the decisive moment of healing has already happened with Jesus, the cross, and his resurrection. And so by the power of his Holy Spirit, we make our way through this broken world. And we don't turn a blind eye to the darkness, but we don't turn a blind eye to the goodness either, the beauty, which is around us, all around us. Anytime you see it in nature, you see it when you are with your friends, with your family, you see it when you gather together and worship God. You see it when you take communion. You see it when you watch somebody get baptized. The world is just overflowing with beauty. So we have every reason to be filled with not only hope, but great expectations. But those expectations are attached to Christ and his kingdom and his reign, not necessarily to the political orders surrounding us. Though we're invested and we care, our ultimate source of hope has to remain Christ. But again, that takes discipline and practice. And that's why worship has to be a whole way of life, a habit, so that we can get in touch with reality and weather all of this with a good perspective. Yeah.
Worship is not a survival strategy. And your goal in life as a Christian is not just to make it on the planet. It's to live here. And so God does have things for us to do. It's not just, hang on by your fingernails until the end. Kingdom of God is advancing. There's a role. We're agents in this. God created us to be such and calls us to do things. And so I think, again, we always hammer this point, but the worst response to any of this is to say, okay, well, I'm going to hop in my bunker and do nothing until I die. The correct response is to, in a Christ-like way, go out and live a life that is for the sake of the kingdom and for the good of your neighbor. And in doing so, I think we find the foundation of our joy and certainly our meaning and responsibility and purpose in it all, that ultimately, if done in a Christ-like way, is good for the fabric of the world, because God created it and said that it's good. And that's a vision worth living in. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events and Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.